Inner meaning of The Last Temptation of Christ. The Last Temptation of Christ is a historical novel written by Nikos Kazantzakis, first published in its original Greek in 1955, before being translated into English in 1960. The Last Temptation of Christ is a 1988 epic religious drama film directed by Martin Scorsese. Table of contents. Prologue. The dual substance of Christ, the yearning soul, human soul, superhuman, of man to attain to God, or more exactly to return to God, and identify himself with Him, has always been a deep, inscrutable mystery to me. And this nostalgia for God, at once so mysterious and so real, has opened in me large wounds and also large flowing springs. My principal anguish and the source of all my joys and sorrows from my youth onward was being the incessant, merciless battle between the spirit and the flesh. Within me are the dark, immemorial forces of the evil one, human and pre-human. Within me too are the luminous forces, human and pre-human, of God, and my soul is the arena where these two armies have clashed and met. The anguish has been intense. I loved my body and did not want it to perish. I loved my soul and did not want it to decay. I have fought to reconcile these two primordial forces, which are so contrary to each other, to make them realize that they are not enemies but rather fellow workers, so that they might rejoice in their harmony, and so that I might rejoice with them. Every man partakes of the divine nature in both his spirit and his flesh. That is why the mystery of Christ is not simply a mystery for a particular creed. It is universal. The struggle between God and man breaks out in everyone, together with the longing for reconciliation. Most often, this struggle is unconscious and short-lived. A weak soul does not have the endurance to resist the flesh for very long. It grows heavy, becomes flesh itself, and the contest ends. But among responsible men who keep their eyes riveted day and night upon their supreme duty, the conflict between flesh and the spirit breaks out mercilessly and may last until death. The stronger the soul and the flesh, the more fruitful the struggle, and the richer the final harmony. God does not love weak souls and flabby flesh. The Spirit wants to wrestle with flesh which is strong and full of resistance. It is a carnivorous bird which is incessantly hungry. It eats flesh and by assimilating it makes it disappear. Struggle between the flesh and the spirit, rebellion and resistance, reconciliation and submission, and finally the supreme purpose of the struggle, union with God. This was the ascent taken by Christ, the ascent which he invites us to take as well, following in his bloody tracks. This is the supreme duty of the man who struggles, to set out for the lofty peak which Christ, the firstborn Son of salvation, attained. How can we begin? If we are to be able to follow him, we must have a profound knowledge of his conflict. We must relive his anguish, his victory over the blossoming snares of the earth, his sacrifice of the great and small joys of man, and his ascent from sacrifice to sacrifice, exploit to exploit, to martyrdom's summit, the cross. I never followed Christ's bloody journey to Golgotha with such terror. I never relived his life and passion with such intensity, such understanding and love as during the days and nights when I wrote The Last Temptation of Christ. While setting down this confession of the anguish and the great hope of mankind, I was so moved that my eyes filled with tears. I had never felt the blood of Christ fall drop by drop into my heart with so much sweetness, so much pain. In order to mount to the cross, the summit of sacrifice, and to God, the summit of immateriality, Christ passed through all the stages which the man who struggles passes through. That is why his suffering is so familiar to us. That is why we share it, and why his final victory seems to us so much our own future victory. That part of Christ's nature which was profoundly human helps us to understand him and love him, and to pursue his passion as though it were our own. If he had not within him this warm human element, he would never be able to touch our hearts with such assurance and tenderness. He would not be able to become a model for our lives. We struggle, we see him struggle also, and we find strength. We see that we are not all alone in the world. He is fighting at our side. Every moment of Christ's life is a conflict and a victory. He conquered the invincible enchantment of simple human pleasures. He conquered temptations, continually transubstantiated flesh into spirit and ascended. Reaching the summit of Golgotha, he mounted the cross. But even there his struggle did not end. Temptation, the last temptation, was waiting for him upon the cross. Before the fainted eyes of the crucified, the spirit of the evil one, in an instantaneous flash, unfolded and deceptive vision of a calm and happy life. It seemed to Christ that he had taken the smooth, easy road of man. He had married and fathered children. People loved and respected him. Now, an old man, he sat on the threshold of his house and smiled with satisfaction as he recalled the longings of his youth. How splendidly, how sensibly he had acted in choosing the road of man. What insanity to have wanted to save the world! What joy to have escaped the privations, the tortures, and the cross! This was the last temptation which came in the space of a lightning flash to trouble the Savior's final moments. But all at once Christ shook his head violently, opened his eyes and saw. No, he was not a traitor, glory be to God. He was not a deserter. He had accomplished the mission which the Lord had entrusted to him. He had not married, had not lived a happy life. He had reached the summit of sacrifice. He was nailed upon the cross. Content, he closed his eyes, and then there was a great triumphant cry. It is accomplished. In other words, I have accomplished my duty. I am being crucified. I did not fall into temptation. This book was written because I wanted to offer a supreme model to the man who struggles. I wanted to show him that he must not fear pain, temptation, or death, because all three can be conquered. All three have already been conquered. Christ suffered pain, and since then pain has been sanctified. Temptation fought until the very last moment to lead him astray, and the temptation was defeated. Christ died on the cross, and at that instant death was vanquished forever. Every obstacle in his journey became a milestone, an occasion for further triumph. We have a model in front of us now, a model who blazes our trial and gives us strength. This book is not a biography. It is the confession of every man who struggles. In publishing it, I have fulfilled my duty, the duty of a person who struggled much, was much embittered in his life, and had many hopes. I am certain that every free man who reads this book, so filled as it is with love, will more than ever before, better than ever before, love Christ. Nikos Kazantzakis.